Today, I'm going to share with you a simple DIY trick for repairing or patching damaged flexible pipes, so you can keep using them instead of replacing them. With a little patience, some basic tools, and a bit of skill, you can easily fix them yourself at home. And I'm curious, what country are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments. And now, let's get started. First, I locate the exact spot where the flexible hose is damaged, then use a cutting tool to cut through the hose and completely remove the damaged section. This step is important because both ends need to be cut as straight and clean as possible, making the connection stronger and giving it a neater appearance. Next, I prepare two small pieces of tubing, each about 1 centimeter long. For each piece, I make a lengthwise cut along the tubing to create an opening. Once that is done, I try inserting each small piece inside the two ends of the flexible hose that I just cut. This creates an internal reinforcement while also allowing me to check whether the size fits properly. Once the small piece is positioned correctly, I use a pin to mark the section that needs to be kept. I want the reinforcement to fit neatly inside the hose, without being too long or sticking out. After marking it, I remove the piece and cut off the excess. I then check the size one more time before placing it back inside the hose. Once the first reinforcement piece fits properly, I carefully insert it into the first end of the hose. I try to keep it centered so that when the two ends are joined together, the connection remains straight and properly aligned. This step also requires a little patience, because applying too much force could deform the flexible hose. After finishing the first end, I move on to the second end. I repeat the same process using another small piece of tubing, cutting it lengthwise, testing the fit, marking the correct size with a pen, and then cutting away the excess. Finally, I insert the second reinforcement piece into the other end of the hose using the same method. At this point, both ends of the hose have been prepared neatly and are ready for the next step. With just a few simple DIY techniques, we can turn a damaged section of flexible hose into a reinforced connection that is ready to be joined and finished. Before welding the two ends of the flexible hose together, I want to test the process on another piece of hose first to make sure everything works as expected. First, I cut a short section of hose and then cut it lengthwise to divide it into two small pieces. Next, I securely clamp a utility knife blade in a vise, then use a gas lighter to heat the blade. Once the blade reaches the appropriate temperature, I carefully bring the two pieces of hose into contact with the hot blade. I apply just enough pressure to soften the plastic surfaces and allow them to bond. Then, I slowly pull the two pieces away from the blade and observe the melted plastic and the resulting weld. Testing on a small piece of hose first allows me to check the heating temperature and timing, making it easier to adjust the technique before working on the main section of hose. Now it's time to move on to the actual welding process. First, I use a small knife to carefully clean the blade that I used during the test weld, removing any plastic residue that remains on it. Then, I use a lighter to heat the blade again. At this stage, I make sure to heat it sufficiently and work carefully to avoid deforming the material. Once the blade reaches the appropriate temperature, I bring the two ends of the flexible hose toward the heated blade and press them gently against it. I hold them there just long enough for the surfaces to soften. Then, I slowly pull the two ends away from the blade. Immediately afterward, I bring the two softened ends back together and hold them firmly in place so that the melted plastic can bond and form a seamless connection. Once the weld has cooled and stabilized, I begin inspecting the entire joint. Using the small knife, I carefully trim away any excess plastic around the welded area and clean the surface to make the connection look neater. Then, I take a close look to check whether the weld is even, sealed, and firmly bonded. Finally, I take 2 pairs of pliers and clamp them onto both sides of the welded hose to test the strength of the connection. I gently pull them apart to see how well the weld holds under tension. This also gives me a chance to compare the result with the test weld I made earlier. If you find this DIY trick useful, have you subscribed to my channel yet? If not, hit the subscribe button to support the channel and join me for more useful and interesting DIY tricks in the upcoming videos. After checking the test piece and seeing that the weld worked very well, I began installing the repaired section of hose into the water system. I carefully connected both ends, checked all the joints once again, and then slowly opened the water valve to test it. As the water began flowing through the hose, I watched the welded area closely to see if there were any signs of leakage. Thankfully, everything worked smoothly, and there was no longer any water leaking like there was at the beginning. Seeing the successful result, I felt relieved and very satisfied with this simple repair method.